So it's been a while since Valve announced a brand new MvM update coming to TF2. The last time this happened was over 12 years ago, so ending that dry streak is very much appreciated. This will no doubt be a massive boon to the game mode's longevity, and I'm happy to see our coveted PvE mode finally get the attention it deserves. But I have concerns. There are a lot, and I do mean a lot of ways that this update can go wrong, and pretty much all of them have been overlooked by the community at large. Now that makes sense. The only thing most people are aware of is a blog post written in voodoo gibberish and endless speculation about what golden skid marks Valve are gonna shit out by next Tuesday. I can assure you, the radar's got more red dots than that. So today we're gonna cover what the Man vs. Machine update actually entails, but more importantly, make it abundantly clear to both Valve and the TF2 fanbase where the tripwires are and how Valve are able to best navigate them. Keep in mind, almost everything I'll be talking about in this video is pure speculation. Nothing here is 100% conclusive. I'm just positing theories based on whatever evidence we have available to us. Starting off with the most pressing ponderance of all, how far is this update going to go? Are we getting bootcamp missions only? Are we getting a brand new MvM tour with recycled loot pools? Or are we getting a fully fleshed out update consisting of new missions on new maps with new loot drops to acquire? Well, by delving into the blog post, we can nail down the criteria a bit. Now, I'd sound like a stroke victim if I attempted to read this out loud, so I'll just hone in on the points worth mentioning. The first of which is Valve alluding to dropping the update around the Scream Fortress update in October, which points in the direction of this being a integrated content patch alongside the standard cosmetic drops and the like. The following statements seem to shit in the same pond, claiming that while the maps did not need to be Halloween themed, some of them could be. The fact that Valve are entertaining the idea of at least a few missions having aesthetic parity with traditional Scream Fortress maps seems to give away the game a bit. While they do state that the maps shouldn't be Halloween themed, that's easy to write off as Valve wanting to keep those maps in rotation long term, similarly to what we already see with the summer and Christmas content of today. So insisting that thematic elements take on more of a generalized form is an easy way to accomplish that goal without detracting from the seasonality of the update. The day one consensus seemed clear. The MvM update would be a branch of this year's Scream Fortress update, but unlike the other Halloween content, it would maintain an in-game presence come November. If that's your default assumption based on the facts presented, I wouldn't blame you. But what if I told you that despite everything presented, Man vs. Machine isn't related to Scream Fortress at all? That sounds like a reach given how much Valve referenced Halloween and Scream Fortress itself in the blog post, but very shortly afterwards, we were given some more illuminating information. TF2 workshopper and fellow YouTuber Cypherlock decided to email Eric Smith, one of the few remaining devs known to be working on TF2. He inquired about the potential for loot drops, which we will come back to, but more relevant to this topic, whether or not the Scream Fortress update would be usurped by the Man vs. Machine one. Eric Smith would reply to his email, stating, in plain English, the Man vs. Machine update will not affect any other updates. Okay. Operating under the premise of this being true, that means that the content structure of Scream Fortress is seemingly going to remain unchanged. Maps, cosmetics, unusual effects, nothing is getting cut. But additionally, note the subtle differentiation between the Man vs. Machine update and the other updates. If a literal developer on the game is psychologically logging these two updates into separate folders, I struggle to contest doing the same thing myself. With this new context in mind, the blog post starts to take on a new form. Under the premise of this update being unrelated to the annual Scream Fortress event, asking for maps not to be Halloween themed is just business as usual, exactly in line with what Valve would do traditionally. Now yes, dropping the update right around Scream Fortress might seem like a strange, content cannibalizing idea, but this isn't a unique case at all. In 2015, we saw the Invasion update drop on October 6th, and more notably, Jungle Inferno released on October 20th. That's 2 of the game's 3 final big years receiving large content updates right in the midst of a Scream Fortress event. Additionally, the blog post concludes by stating that a glimpse of the update could arrive as early as Wednesday, August 27th, and that a second part would arrive right before Halloween. That August 27th date is very noteworthy because that is the explicit deadline given to MvM map creators to submit their missions to the workshop. Yet, somehow, we're still due for a tease, a precursor to the update, potentially this week? This has got to be one of the most surprisingly overlooked parts of the blog post. What could this prelude be alluding to? It's not a new mission, there's just no way. So, bug fixes? Upgrade balance changes? A new menu with a grayed out tour box labeled coming soon? If you want to get really doomer about it, they did use the word could, which is always an easy escape hatch when you overpromise something too early. But there is one thing we can confirm. Nothing like this has ever happened for a glorified Scream Fortress update. Moreover, a 2-month time frame to complete a solid map and missions implemented alongside it is way too short. Missions particularly require a lot of meticulous design and redesign brought about by an abundance of trial and error. 60 days ain't gonna cut it for a new MvM map. My belief is that this deadline is merely meant as a grace period for already established MvM creators to touch up their previous work before throwing them onto the workshop. Valve have promoted Potato.tf for years, the leading hub for community MvM campaigns, even allowing accompanying medals to make their way into the game. Guys like Robin Walker, Dave Riller, and even Eric himself have openly played on community missions. On stream, mind you. Valve are well aware of the treasure trove of content that they're missing out on. So if I was a gambling man, which I am, this is what I'd bet on being the most likely outcome. I wish we had more conclusive evidence to go off of, but based on everything presented, this all points towards an update that may borrow some Halloween elements, but is almost entirely unrelated to the Scream Fortress update, and we don't need to rely on an offhand comment from Eric to solidify that. Now, why does this matter? Well, first, it's worth dispelling the fear that Valve are just gonna import half a dozen buggy missions, throw them into boot camp, and call it a day. Would be very unbecoming of the much-needed qualifier. But second, it opens up a very interesting question. If the update isn't a Scream Fortress subsidiary, how are workshoppers gonna get paid? The traditional payout method in regards to community content is a royalty, a slice of every key sold pertaining to their accompanying cases. Hats, taunts, war paints, unusual effects, everyone's getting a tiny piece of that revenue pie. Included in that list of benefactors, map makers, and this has never not been the case. Now, if the update was related to Scream Fortress, there you go. That's your payout model, easy as that. But under the pretext of this being a detached update, what are they gonna do? Map stamps only? I've been asking around, and literally not one workshopper has been able to confirm that this has happened even once. This means that Valve would need to establish a new revenue model for this new MvM tour. The one I've heard being tossed around is that Valve will likely create a separate MvM ticket specifically pertaining to this brand new Man Up tour, distributing the proceeds as they see fit. My intuition is that this will likely be the case. I have yet to hear an argument for why another model would be more preferred. But therein lies the big question on everybody's mind. If Valve are going to add in a new Man Up tour with purchasable tickets, you're gonna need some kind of bangin' ass loot to get people through the door. Of course, I'm talking about the gold, man. The number one thing everyone thinks of when they hear new MvM update are the motherfucking Australiums. Are we getting new ones? Are Valve gonna port over the ones we already have? Is this new tour ditching them entirely and going back to bot killers only? Well, we can hopefully scratch off that last one. Before the last update was unveiled, Valve decided to add a 7-day trading restriction to the Golden Pan. What the fuck? Why? The Golden Pan has been in the game since the Two Cities update over 12 years ago. And now, over a decade later, we're getting a trade restriction added out of nowhere? It seems to me that Valve are heavily anticipating a larger surplus of Golden Pan drops brought about by an increase of activity within the paid version of the game mode. I find it very hard to believe that all of this is just a coincidence. If the pan's on the table, the likelihood that traditional Australiums are as well is pretty damn high. The main question is whether or not we're getting new golden goodies or rehashing old ones. From a monetary point of view, the obvious answer is to drop us a new batch, but it's also the obvious answer to finally give us strange versions of the Jungle Inferno weapons, and Valve are about 3,000 days late to that call. This is why I've been very hesitant to treat new Australiums like a foregone conclusion. A bunch of fancy reskins would give TF2 the highest ROI they've seen in years for comparatively not that much work at all, but despite that, their current status remains tentative at best. Many people have viewed Australiums as officially deconfirmed after Eric's email response was circulated, but to be fair, the language he uses is very vague and inconclusive. If Valve were planning on adding new Australiums, the email would likely read the exact same way, so I don't view this as concrete proof of anything specifically. I do wonder why Valve would neglect to mention the existence of Australiums anywhere on the blog post if it was such a sure thing on being added though. Seems like an obvious hype maneuver. I hope that Valve recognized that when TF2 players hear much needed MvM update, they think Australiums. Not maps, not robots, definitely not bot killers, Australium weapons. Worst case scenario, we just get the old ones ported over. But fuck me if that wouldn't be such a wasted opportunity. This is a core tenet of the MvM ecosystem that everyone intuitively understands. Loot is what dictates player behavior. People can say they play man-up mode for fun all they want, but stated and revealed preferences are two very different things. I don't understand the obsession people have with treating the joy of spinning roulette wheels as if it's a mode of entertainment that's beneath them. Are we really gonna sit here and pretend that Two Cities is 80 times more fun than Steel Trap? Get fucking real. The same reason people binge man up mode is the same reason Nevada doesn't have a state income tax. One day MvM players will start being honest with themselves. The results are crystal fucking clear. If your loot is shitty, so are your player numbers. Valve need to recognize that the player base are gonna go where the getting's good, and failure to account for this could have serious ramifications on the game mode long term. In fact, I would argue there's one pivotal decision that Valve need to make correctly should they go out of their way to add a new batch of golden weapons. Do not share the Australium loot pools. One of the biggest fears a lot of MvM players have regarding the update is whether or not this new tour will invalidate content from years past. This worry isn't without merit. In fact, Valve had this very exact thing happen during 2013 when Two Cities first dropped. It was the only tour in the game that had access to those coveted Australian weapons, and this drastic discrepancy in loot value resulted in the widespread abandonment of every other tour in the game. Valve would recognize that this distribution was extremely unhealthy, so they opted to port over the new Australium drops to the other tours around a year later. This was a great call on Valve's end. It allowed for more content to be viable for Australium farming beyond Two Cities. Robot parts and fabricators are still MIA, but 2 out of the 4 advanced tours are only composed of 3 missions. So porting those over to Mecha and Gear Grinder would result in the permanent invalidation of Two Cities as a tour. The same problem, just in the opposite direction. So, if porting over the Australiums was an undeniable benefit of the prior content, why am I advocating not to port over the Australium loot pools if it helped revitalize prior tours in the past? Well, because it would do the exact opposite. One of the tricky variables that Valve need to account for is that most of the community-made missions are pretty short compared to Valve standards. This isn't a negative, by the way. In fact, in many ways, it's a conduit for why community MvM missions have the positive reputations that they do. Look, I love Valve missions, I play them all the time, but goddamn, do they have pacing issues, and a lot of them. Be it padding the mission with a bunch of robot filler to artificially lengthen the waves, or endless periods of downtime where you're just waiting on robots to drop down from the front. This type of mission padding is rightfully viewed as poor design from the community MvM scene, and over the years, there's been enough cultural conditioning to broadly discourage it. In addition to better wave pacing, most maps have adopted the Rottenberg style of dropping an upgrade station near the front lines. This expedites the upgrade purchasing process, and in doing so, leads to faster F4s all around. once again lessening downtime. Potato.tf would also recommend much shorter mission timeframes to bolster their eligibility for their community campaigns. Again, this isn't a bad thing. The robot layouts are a lot more compact, more wheat, less chaff. This is much more pronounced on the lower difficulty levels. Intermediate missions tend to run around 20 to 25 minutes, advanced around 30 to 35, though keep in mind that the competency of the community MvM mission groups is usually much higher. This discrepancy in time investment, both among community missions and when contrasted to Valve missions, presents a very unfortunate situation for Valve. They either make a 4-mission man-up tour that takes a lot less time to complete due to the shorter mission lengths, or they can make a 5 to 6 mission tour depending on the difficulty level, but that means forcing the player base to buy extra tickets in order to fully complete each mission. Now let's imagine a scenario where Valve decide to merge the Australium loot pools. You can get the Gen 1 Australiums on the new content and the hypothetical Gen 2 Australiums on the old content. Well, now that you've equalized the output, all attention will shift towards the input. How much time and how much money are you giving up to get a spin at the wheel? Remember, loot dictates player behavior. If the new Man Up tour is 4 missions long, say goodbye to 2 cities for life, alongside every other tour for that matter. The faster mission times will let players farm the same loot for the same price while shaving off a third of the time investment. This would immediately displace every other tour in the game into a pit of irrelevance. You wanted Halloween maps? There's your fucking graveyard. Alternatively, if the new tour is 6 missions long, you may have equalized the time investment, but you made it cost $6 for a full completion instead of 4. Congratulations, you just butchered your new tour right out of the womb. No one is going to pay a 50% premium to farm the same drops as another tour. There's a theoretical tightrope Valve can walk where both the price of admission and completion times are relatively equalized compared to 2 cities, but does anyone trust Valve to stick that landing? I don't. My main concern here is that Valve have PTSD from the mass tour cleansing they pulled back in 2013, and might believe that merging the loot pools once again would prevent another replication of that event. But that misses the point as to why the problem ever existed in the first place. The issue with the other MvM tours wasn't that they didn't drop Australiums, the issue was that the loot that they did have, bot killers, are dangly little ballsack weapons and nobody cares about them. Apathy does not breed desire. It just breeds more apathy. Australian weapons, even 12 years after release, do not have this problem. Prices have remained stable for literal years despite the supply of weapons increasing day after day. And the reason for that is TF2 players like Australiums. That's really all there is to it. Especially when you consider that many of them are tied to very popular and/or iconic weapons, demand always catches up eventually. I think we can all understand that upon this new tour's release, every other MvM map will be barren for a while. This is an inevitability, and most players are completely fine with that. However, that only serves to improve the longevity of the old tours over time. If everyone's off farming the new Australiums and new Australiums only, what do you think happens to the old ones? Basic economics. Supply gets constrained, prices go up, and rewards for playing the old tours become more valuable. This creates added incentive for MvM players to go back and run that old school content. This issue will quite literally solve itself and create a healthy long-term player distribution as long as Valve doesn't port over the loot pools. Every tour will serve a purpose. The new one is where you farm the new Australiums, 2 cities is where you farm the old ones with the tertiary loot that increases the overall ROI, and Gear Grinder and Mecha Engine are where you go to farm the fastest Gen 1 lever pulls at the expense of overall profitability. If you actually give people reasons to seek out the new content and the legacy content, both of them will remain alive and well. If you want to port over the robot parts and killstreak kits, I don't have a problem with that personally, but the big ticket items need to be separated. Let's also not forget the benefits beyond keeping old content relevant. Imagine running this new tour for the new Australian weapons, and you get one that's already been in the game for a decade already. That'd be a huge letdown. Additionally, it also safeguards prior content if the new map additions aren't anybody's cup of tea. If the update ends up being a dud, at the very least it doesn't come at the expense of old content getting invalidated. It's a win-win situation for literally everyone involved, and I seriously hope that Valve go in this direction, provided they actually decide to add new Australians at all. This is all based on a hypothetical. On a personal note, I think a 6-mission tour mirroring the difficulty found in 2 cities would be most optimal, given how short those missions of equivalent difficulty tend to be on community servers. But we do run into the problem of those $1 ticket costs adding up extremely fast. To counteract this, I say drop the new tickets down to 50 cents a piece. That way the price of admission doesn't act as a massive barrier to entry in relation to other tours. I'm not convinced that literally any of this is on Valve's radar at all, but that also applied to the upgrade blocking bots, air blast griefing, and the Coal Town mission exploit. And all of you got those patched up very quickly when my community started talking about them. I'd urge all of you to do the same for this issue, because it's incredibly important. This leads us to another large discrepancy between Valve MvM and community MvM: mission difficulty. This is where another unfortunate problem presents itself. The community mission player base exhibits a much higher skill level on average compared to that of your average Valve mission player base. As a result, community missions often account for that heightened skill distribution whenever labeling their mission difficulties. And that leads to some missions being wildly inconsistent with what falls under the bounds of Valve's difficulty settings. Community intermediates are closer to Valve Advanced, Community Advanced is closer to Valve Expert, and Community Expert is more difficult than anything you'll find in the base game, including Wave 666 for that matter. This one will probably get me in trouble, but I think it's best that every single community mission with an expert label should be ineligible for inclusion, at least for an official man-up tour. They're way too far beyond the scope of what new missions should provide for the average TF2 player, and I don't think even entertaining the possibility is warranted. I know a lot of hardcore MvM players like brawling their way through Hellzone missions, but this update isn't made for you. It's made for everybody, and to provide the most value for the most amount of people, the content should be both accessible and widely palatable to TF2 players of all stripes. That doesn't mean give us a baby-proof idle rock mission or something like that, but simply maintaining the same standard of difficulty we see in the base game today is the safest bet we could possibly take. The number one source of conflict in pretty much any multiplayer game is always tied down to how much one person wants a thing and how hard your teammates are preventing you from getting it. This is largely why Boot Camp has shirked a lot of the MvM toxicity allegations. Nothing to gain, nothing to lose. Lower stakes means lower conflict. It's also why Man Up mode has actually gotten less toxic over the years as well. The community missions got easier, the player base got better, and the shiny loot became more mundane. The byproduct of this was an overall reduction in tension between players. Not to say that dickbags in MvM don't exist. They do. But as each year goes by, those players tend to become less and less prominent. Now let's imagine a world where Valve do add in Australian weapons, creating a massive collective desire among the player base, and pair that with a series of incredibly difficult missions with meta-breaking strategies forced onto a population of mostly inexperienced players. Oh yeah, the hyenas would be out for blood. All of this to say, if you dangle shiny new toys in front of a bunch of TF2 players, you're gonna get people elbowing their mom in the face to get them quicker. A mission's difficulty is what defines the necessary amount of competence needed to get things done. The higher that bar is, the higher percentage of groups that won't meet it. And we all know how MvM players can get about that. Let's just acknowledge this right now. Launch week for the update is gonna be a fucking mess, and Balance is no exception to that. The dissonance between Valve missions and community missions is so large that there's no way they're gonna get everything right on the first try. Fortunately for us, not only are the MvM community creators willing to nerf their missions if they're deemed too challenging, but many of them have been proactive in rebalancing them to be more in line with what Valve's looking for in the base game. Adding on to this, Valve are no stranger to rebalancing missions themselves in the name of accessibility. So if both players and mission creators want those tuning kinks ironed out, the odds of Valve complying with that are pretty damn high. You don't even need to nerf the robot layouts either. You could also buff the credit pools to give each team member more upgrades per wave. This would only really apply to missions that don't have their main balancing mechanisms tied to absurd credit numbers, but most of them have enough room to allow for extra player buffs without getting too bloated. Simple number tweaks in either direction could easily weed out any balancing issues very quickly. So while I predict a shaky start, start, eventually the plane will be landed. Personally, I think both Community Intermediate and Community Advanced missions should be on the table for a base game release. Anything else should be left off the table. As for the actual substance behind the new content, this is an area where I'm nowhere near as concerned as a lot of players, at least pertaining to the supply side of quality missions to choose from. Demand is a different story. There's been a lot of hootin' and hollerin' about how the MvM update is gonna blow cock because Valve are relying on community-created content. I can only assume the people making these criticisms have never once played a custom mission in their life. I don't know where this idea came from that community made is now somehow a pejorative. Either a map is good or it isn't. I don't care who or where it came from. Fortunately, the community MvM scene has collectively dedicated thousands of hours to creating hundreds of missions for the game. Again, Potato.tf, the main hub for community MvM, only takes money for charity events and server maintenance, with all the server infrastructure being run out of one guy's basement. With this backlog of content, it wasn't made for money or fame or perverse incentives, it was all made for one reason and one reason only: passion. They like the game. Admittedly, I'm not the best person to vouch for this, as my experience is nowhere near where it should be. You know the kind of chef that eats McDonald's every night because the last thing they want to do is spend their free time on more cooking? Yeah, the analogy applies. However, you don't need to rely on my opinion here. Every mission on the Potato campaign is reviewed by multiple teams of judges before getting tossed into the rotation, and the player base seems to be in line with the judges' viewpoints. Looking at the reviews for these missions, most of them have a 4 out of 5 rating minimum, and even the ones that don't aren't far behind. Valve could hire a monkey to throw darts at a community MvM mission board, and you'd likely come away with a decent tour. They would actively have to try to fuck up this update by going out of their way to pick overly wacky maps that deviate from the traditional MvM experience and spark massive contention among the player base. Oops. Yeah, originally the fear of over-the-top mission mechanics alongside very polarizing map design wasn't something I was too concerned with. You don't have to look very far to figure out that a lot of community MvM missions are the makings of a child that ate too much Play-Doh and psilocybin. Most of these aren't being submitted, the ones that are have been heavily modified, and oftentimes they rely on source mod plugins to allow for whatever crazy shit they put in. It's fair to assume that some missions might fall through the cracks, but there's a treasure trove of other missions unbefitting of that wacky categorization. They're so minimal in number that, again, even a dart-throwing monkey would likely miss all of them. This is why I was extremely optimistic for the map choices once the update first got announced. There are too many popular, too many widely enjoyed MvM maps to not get a mostly good tour out of it. Summer 2024 has unfortunately toyed with my optimism a bit. Valve are starting to value novelty, experimentation, a fresh experience, regardless as to whether or not that fresh experience is actually palatable. Now I've become a bit more cautious, as there are a bunch of good MvM maps that have both thematic and gameplay elements that are very ill-suited towards a base game tour. Some maps are centered around medieval mode weapon restrictions, some maps have players locked onto only one class, Casino City has intra-wave gambling mechanics, Scallops has jump power-ups scattered across the map, Charon seems to have good reviews on the gameplay front, but fuck me if this doesn't look like an Xbox 360 Star Wars game, Trainyard has too many trains. Even a lot of the more normal maps have robot concepts that inch way too far into Crazy Town. Now, I would have written these ones off as laughable inclusions for an official Valve tour a year ago, but I'm not so sure I should be laughing anymore. I don't even mean to disparage the people who made these maps. They all work completely fine in a community context, which is the exact context that they were made under to begin with. But for official, in-game accessible MvM missions, these ones should stay on the cutting room floor. I'd also say that we keep reskin maps out of the equation. Nothing wrong with them inherently, but there's a finite amount of space on the podium, and I don't want it going to a map that we already have. There are also a lot of absurdist elements to community MvM maps, like pre-game lore dumps and alike, but I trust that mission makers wouldn't want these to make their way into the base game, as a lot of it is contained to community MvM culture. I don't have confirmation on that one way or the other, but that's what I predict. What I personally advocate for is controlled novelty. New robots using new weapons inside of new maps on new missions, but keep everything in line with the traditional MvM formula we've come to expect. No need to reinvent the wheel here. Aim in that direction, and we shouldn't see any problems with mission cohesion based on that premise alone. And that'll set us up for the best foundation possible. So, final thoughts. I'm excited for the MvM update. No matter what happens, this is going to be a lot of fun in the short term, and no doubt the game mode will get a huge influx in players once the tour releases. However, whether or not they decide to stick around will be entirely contingent on how accurately Valve get the basics down. Add new Australiums, don't merge the loot pools across tours, keep the fantastical map elements to a minimum, and adjust mission difficulty according to player feedback. I don't know if Valve realizes just how much the player base will forgive them for if they can just get those 4 things right. Launch day will be fucked. If you're going in expecting it not to be, disappointment will follow. It'll be a clusterfuck. But the silver lining there is at least we get some good memories out of it. We'll be reminiscing on those vanilla missions like a nom-vet talking to their kids. I expect a lot of outrage around this time, but for me it's so inevitable that I've basically become numb to thinking about it. What I really care about are the intentional design problems, not the unintentional ones, because those actually have long-term ramifications on the health of the game mode. People claim that the worst case scenario for the update is Valve just throwing in a couple shitty bootcamp missions and calling it a day. That isn't true. It'd be a massive disappointment, yeah, but it wouldn't be actively harmful to the modern game. The actual worst case scenario is they add in a few shitty missions, add them to bootcamp and man up, and that content becomes a replacement for the already well-liked MvM content instead of a supplement. If you port over the Gen 1 Australiums, this kind of intra-game mode competition is all but guaranteed. So how about we not let that happen? The cool thing about Man vs. Machine is because it's been so dry on content updates for over a decade, anything we get has a disproportionately outsized effect on the game. Sure, half a dozen new maps for casual mode is just more sand on the pile, but for MvM, half a dozen new maps is quite literally doubling the game mode's variety. That's a big deal. Solely because of that, I am excited for the update, but I hope people can understand why I've tempered my expectations in regards to the long term. Hopefully shining a light on these potential problems early will minimize the chances they actualize in real time. For me, Man vs. Machine was always another way to keep myself engaged with the game. A third funnel of content to enjoy when casual got boring and community servers are inactive. This update has a real shot at revitalizing that funnel for thousands of other players, and that's why I'm hoping they get it right. If you guys want to check out Community MvM and maybe get a preview as to what might appear in the update, Potato.tf has a massive 60 mission campaign running as we speak. There's no better time to give it a shot than right now. Start from intermediate and work your way up. It'll be easier that way. I'll also be streaming community runs with my viewers on Twitch, so go follow me there if you're interested. We're gonna shoot for as many missions as possible, and I'll compile my favorites into a video very soon. If you got any suggestions for what to check out, let me know in the comments below. Anyways, thank you all for watching the video. Twitter, Discord, second channel, and Twitch are all in the description, and that's all I got. See ya.